Okay, I see a few people logging on. All right, well, how about we get this started? Welcome to today's talk on Latinas, the New Blue Wave, a workshop on research and voter empowerment with Stephanie Valencia. I am Teresa Acuña. I'm Associate Director of Democratic Governance Programs at the Ash Center. And if this is your first time joining our events, the Ash Center is one of 12 research think tanks at the Harvard Kennedy School. And among the many things we do, we focus on bridging academia and practice to improve our democracy. I want to start us off with some housekeeping announcements. First, I want to thank you in advance for your patience for any technical glitches we may encounter today. To minimize interruptions, the audience is muted, but we encourage you to use the chat box for questions or comments. We will dedicate about the last 15 minutes of our time together for discussion and questions. But if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you should feel free to use the chat box again to send those over, and we will answer them at the end. This event is being recorded, and you can find it on the Ash Center website for future viewing. And today's event is part of our Technology and Democracy Fellowship Workshop Series. The fellowship is composed of mid-career practitioners who are leveraging technology to improve democratic governance. They use their affiliation with our center to incubate new ideas and explore ways to improve democracy and the ways citizens participate in it. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Stephanie Valencia, our current Ash Center Tech and Democracy Fellow. Stephanie works at the intersection of civic participation, leadership development, politics, and technology. She is the co-founder of EquisLabs, an organization which aims to create a more active and powerful Latinx electorate. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks everyone for joining wherever you are today, and hopefully you are healthy and safe. I'm really excited to hopefully give you a little bit of a distraction for today to think about the future and talk about the importance of Latinas and Hispanic women in the upcoming 2020 election. As Teresa mentioned, I'm the co-founder of EquisLabs and Equis Research, and have been a fellow at the Ash Center for the last several months. It's a bummer I haven't been able to spend more time in Boston and not to be able to do this in person, but hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation and a relationship between the work at Equis and Harvard as we continue. As Teresa mentioned, at EquisLabs, we're working to create a better understanding of the Latinx electorate and invest in new and innovative approaches to reach and engage them, specifically using digital data and tech tools. I want to start with the topic of this presentation, though, today, which will talk a little bit more specifically about some of the research that we have done. And how we are working to leverage that research to better reach and engage Latina female voters in the 2020 election. If you do not come from a Latino family, it's hard to communicate the importance of Latino women in our community. They are the glue and the backbones of our families and our communities. They are our matriarchs, our soccer moms, or young college-age women. We believe that Latinas are the secret weapon to the Latinx vote. And the reason is their power lies in the social networks that they hold and their ability to catalyze them to influence those around them, their family, their friends, and their community. And it's because of this that we believe, as our research has pointed out, and that as I will walk you through today, that Latinas have the potential to be the real difference makers in 2020 and beyond. But as I will outline today, this will not just happen. Next slide. Over the course of the last year, we've embarked on a research project, really since last summer, measuring the sentiment of Latinx voters in 11 different states. And over the course of that time, we've interviewed over 30,000 Latinos, which gives us a unique view and perspective into the different cleavages that exist in the Latinx electorate. Next slide. Those of you can jump into the chat box and tell me where this picture is from. This is the monolith from 2001, A Space Odyssey. And the point of including this slide is to prove that, and dispel the notion that Latinos are anything but that, which is a monolith. Again, in the over 30,000 interviews that we have collected over time, we've been able to really dissect and understand really important cleavages in the electorate around the differences that vary by state, differences that vary by age or generation or country of origin. And so one thing that we have, one of our greatest findings over the last year that we have discovered is with gender. And one of the greatest gaps in opportunities that we have found is within gender and the role that Latinas can play in 2020. And so what more I will show you today is while we found that Latinas are more motivated to vote, we have also come to believe that motivation in and of itself is not enough to get them to the ballot box. We're concerned that if a Latina remains motivated, but not enthusiastic or excited, she herself will turn out to vote, but may not take others with her. So to truly tap into that power of Latino women in 2020, there will be a need for strategic investment and resources to be made to communicate and engage Latinas in a very real level to build their confidence and increase their enthusiasm and excitement about the process. And obviously in the moment in time that we are in this current COVID health crisis, that work is going to be even more important and more challenging. But here's why this should matter to anybody who cares about talking to Latino voters in 2020. One, Latinos broadly and Latinas especially are the rare demographic among which non-voters are more progressive than actual voters. So the voters who are registered to vote but are choosing not to vote, if we can go back to the last slide, who are choosing not to vote, or they are unregistered and eligible, are more progressive than those who are likely to vote. Secondly, there's a greater share of non-voting Latinos than likely voters in most of the critical battleground states, which means the share of the population who are eligible to vote who aren't voting either because they're not registered or they're registered and not voting is a larger part of the electorate in all 11 battleground states than those who are likely voters who are Latino. So there's a huge swath of people that we are not talking to, and a lot of those happen to be Latina. And third, Latinas have the numbers. They make up the largest age and gender cohorts in most key battleground states. And as I will walk you through today with their levels of support for progressive policies and high levels of anti-Trump sentiment, when we're looking for new votes, Latinas are an obvious place to start. But that's not going to come with some challenges, especially in this current environment that we're in around increasing turnout that has to be overcome. And if we're able to do this, I think you will see Latinas leading the next blue wave. So let's head to the next slide. Let's paint a picture of where we're starting. When we look at the number of different markers for support on Trump, urban versus rural, gender, women versus men, the number of generations, whether you're foreign born or you're third generation, your country of origin, whether you're from Mexico or you're from Central America, you're married or unmarried, or religion, Catholic or Protestant evangelical. You can see that some of the markers that we might think might separate Latino voters in their support for Trump might be things like country of origin or the number of generations they've been in this country. Those have been some of the conventional wisdom that maybe the longer that you're in this country, the more conservative you may be. But as we can see here from the over 30,000 interviews we've done, that's not necessarily a marker of division. The two biggest markers of division are gender and religion. And so today we are going to dig in a little bit more on gender. Next slide. As we head toward November 2020, EquisLabs research has continued to track this gender gap that has persisted among Latino voters over time. Right now, and as you can see in the last line there, there's the culmination of all of our 30,000 interviews and the gender gap average across those interviews. Right now, the gender gap is larger than it's ever been. The closest it's ever, which is 14 points. The closest it's ever come to this is in 2012 with Romney-Obama, where the gender gap was 10 points on election day, or in 2000 with Bush v. Gore, where it was 9 points. So if the election were held today, the gender gap between Latino women and Latino men would be the largest in recent history. Next slide. Here you can see what that looks like by state and how the gender gap exists by state. So you can see here, or not the gender gap, but how Hispanic women support varies by state. So here you can see when we asked a question related to presidential vote choice, will you vote for a generic Democrat or will you vote for Donald Trump? You can see the levels of the high levels of support for an unnamed generic Democratic candidate. You can see some of the widest gaps exist in places like Wisconsin, Virginia, North Carolina, not necessarily places you would think might be the places that are leading kind of progressivism. Arizona and Colorado as well. You see the lowest or the highest numbers of support for Trump in places like New Mexico and Nevada. Next slide. So when we also look deeper into EQUI's polling among rural Latina women and Latino men on the issue of the economy, this was prior to the coronavirus, so we are in the midst of trying to assess sentiment right now, we identify another chasm of the gender gap, a stark 51% point difference of approval in Trump's handling of the economy between rural women and rural men. So what accounts for this gap? I think we might say and hypothesize that because Latinas identify most strongly with the Latino community identity at large, they are more sensitive to Trump's attacks. They're also most affected by the economy, in part because they are often the ones determining and paying the bills and managing the household finances. And so they are more unhappy about the state of Trump's economy and more likely to say that their personal financial situation has not improved in the current economy, at least pre-coronavirus. Next slide. And when we look at the lens of religion, there are some surprising findings that would challenge, I think, conventional wisdom. Latinos also have been painted by conventional wisdom, I think more socially as social conservatives, especially on the issue of choice. So what EQUI's polling has uncovered, however, is that across all states polled, a majority of Latinos generally support a woman's right to choose, 62% on average, including access to a safe and healthy abortion, and by fairly wide margins, as you can see by this slide. Those numbers remain consistent when you dig down and look at gender and ask just about Latinas. It stays about 62 to 64%. Next slide. Now let's shift to another critical measure about understanding Latina support in this current moment in time, which is motivation and excitement. In our polling, we ask two questions. Are you motivated to vote? And are you excited to vote? We see these as two very distinct measures to try to understand a voter's intention and to vote. Motivation is you are watching, you are processing, you are kind of taking in what is happening. And excitement is you are ready to catalyze and take others with you. You're ready to do the actual act of voting. And across the board, while we see the levels of anti-Trumpism running very deep among Latinas, especially on average across our polling since last summer, Latino women have held steady in their disapproval of Donald Trump across all age groups, as you can see here. From Gen Z women to our moms and our abuelitas, who are north of 60% here in this Democratic support margin, which you can see at the bottom of this chart. But excitement, as you can see, and motivation seems to lag behind men. You see men with lower support, lower levels of support on the Democratic side, and higher motivation to vote. Whereas you see higher levels of support among women of all age groups, but lower motivation to support. So again, Latinas, while they do not seem to have as high motivation to vote, we're concerned if they remain this way and they do not become enthusiastic about the actual act of voting, they will not turn out to vote and will not put in the work to mobilize or persuade those around them, as we previously mentioned. So while Latinas are activated and willing to tap into their social networks, that is where the real payoff comes in to play with Latinas. This voting contagion, we believe, is the secret ingredient of what Latinas can bring in 2020 and why we should continue to track their levels of excitement. And hopefully over time, we will see those continue to increase. Next slide. Additionally, when you look at men and women with children, we can also see a similar gap here. Moms continue to be very anti-Trump, yet less motivated to vote than men with children. Next slide. And here you can see other measures and breakdowns of motivation and excitement compared across other cuts of our polling. You can see in places like Colorado, North Carolina, and Texas where it's different. You can see among the likeliest voters, we have a lot of work to do to increase excitement among those who are most likely to vote. And you can see that, again, women continue to not have the highest levels of motivation and excitement that we would like to see. Next slide. So again, as we see huge opportunities for Latinas given their high levels of support for a progressive policy agenda, there are real concerns given historic trends in turnout that there is still a lot of room for growth. So when we look at Latina turnout, it has been trending in the right direction, but still remains lower than that of Black women and white women, presenting an opportunity to bring new people into the process. Now the question becomes, why have we seen this lag? The Topos Partnership, which is a C3 research institute, has done important research digging into the drivers behind lower Latino voter turnout, and what they have discovered held some further surprise. Lower turnout is not necessarily driven by apathy. In fact, quite the opposite. First of all, Latino voters don't necessarily feel confident to vote. The notion that there are so many things that they could get wrong in the process, that the ballot is too overwhelming to understand, they just don't want to mess up. Secondly, Topos found that Latino voters are also concerned that their vote won't really matter or it won't really make a difference. So again, increasing turnout among Latino voters will depend on developing strategies that address these barriers to voting. Among many of Topos's recommendations, they found that building more confidence to vote doesn't necessarily mean just providing more information, but rather can be built by shifting the expectation from knowing enough and caring enough. And shifting confidence also means creating the notion that the voter is already well prepared to make good decisions about voting, and especially giving them confidence about what they are voting for, maybe their children, their family, their community. So it is inspiring confidence. It's not necessarily providing more information. So to know how much work we still will have to do on this front, our polling, we are going to have to continue to track this question on voting enthusiasm and continue to identify what are the right motivators and the right messages to urge those women to vote. As I mentioned earlier, Latinas and Latinos specifically make up the largest share of non-voters in a lot of these different states, and non-voters exceed the number of likely voters in many of these states. And again, many of those non-voters are Latino women. Next slide. Now on immigration, and we know the kind of conversation that we've been having on immigration over the last many years in this country are really starting to have an impact and an effect on this community and how they view their participation, that not just how they view Donald Trump and how they view his policies and the impact on the community, but could begin to start to have a very unintended consequence of suppression that we also want to keep an eye on. We discover that Latinas and Latina Catholics, and especially Latina church-going women, cite the issue of Donald Trump's morality as a major concern for them. Similarly, his handling of the issue of immigration, and namely, they identify and have identified in focus groups, kids in cages, the border wall, and his handling of the migrant crisis those are major issues for how they are viewing, his performance. So overall, what we can take away from the data that we've gathered to date and as measured against past trends is Latinas again are deeply anti-Trump, especially because of his lack of morality and handling of immigration, an issue that is very personal to them. And they support, broader progressive issues like abortion that we may have previously underestimated their support. So you can see here in this chart the stellar level of immigration numbers that Trump has, achieved. The only place, and this was again pre-coronavirus, where folks gave him some credence was on the economy. And I'm guessing that we will find in future polling that that may have shifted and changed. And so again, this notion around immigration and morality is a key set of issues for Latino women, but especially Latina church-going Catholic women is something that we also want to continue to track. Next slide. In addition to immigration, one other challenge for Latina turnout is how they view discrimination. I'm going to talk through this slide here in a second, but discrimination can cut both ways in this community and again, have some unintended consequences, as I mentioned. Our polling shows that Latinos blame Trump for an increase in discrimination against Hispanics. We polled this question after the El Paso shooting last August, and it appears to really be a motivating factor for those with a very strong sense of their Latino identity who really identify with the community, which is a large share of those are Latino women. But our research also finds that other research finds that when more assimilated Latinos perceive greater discrimination against them, it doesn't always result in greater levels of voting. It actually leads to a lack of trust and a lower likelihood of voting. So this is the careful balance that we have to really try to understand in how we are communicating about being discriminated against, but also not overstepping to create unintended consequences and a lower levels of trust in the community. Because as you can see from this focus group that we did in Wisconsin, not just the issue of discrimination is very personal, but the issue of immigration is very personal. And so this is an anecdote from a focus group we did in Wisconsin that highlights the personal impact that Latinas are experiencing in this moment in time. And again, this was even before the coronavirus. So I can only imagine that the kind of personal and experiential impact that people are having, Latinos are having specifically, is much deeper in this moment. So this illustrates why we may be seeing lower levels of excitement and why it's really important that we give these women something to hope for. As you can see, this person's, parents self-deported right before Christmas last year, and just how heavy and hard that is for her, and how much it generates a level of PTSD for her, and that she's probably voting. So she's in that category of, she might be, intending to vote a particular way, but because she is probably voting, there's a lot that could swing her from definitely voting to probably choosing not to vote, because either she's intimidated by the process, she doesn't think her vote matters, or she is feeling just completely disillusioned from the process because what has happened to her family, and feeling really overwhelmed by the impact of that to her and her family and the results of her vote. Next slide. So to conclude, what we have understood from the last year of research is that just the simple threat or fear of another 4 years of Donald Trump is not enough to motivate Latina voters. So to increase participation, studies have shown that you have to pair a threat message with an opportunity message that emphasizes what we can achieve as a group if we vote together. A message combining threat and opportunity can have a significant mobilizing effect, and women are especially positioned to receive it well. Bernard Fraga, who is a Stanford professor, did some research on the turnout gap. Again, this level of turnout between men and women generally, and voters of color, and has found that, quote, as you can see here, when a group is perceived to drive election outcomes, members of that group are more likely to turn out and vote, both in that individuals are more likely to vote when they expect to be able to influence the political process, and in that candidates and parties are more likely to court them if they view them as decisive. So, as I've laid out, there's incredible power to be found in the Latina female electorate if we can convince them that they hold the keys to the future of this country. This is a moment in time where we need to create a self-fulfilling prophecy among Latina women that they can and will be the decision makers in this election. In other words, if we want Latinas to be decisive in this election, we need to say it out loud and say it often that Latinas are going to be decisive in this election. If it is a self-fulfilling prophecy, only if we make it one. So with that, I will stop and take some questions. I would love to have a little bit of a discussion and make this a little or more interactive if folks are open to it, to have a conversation about what it means to actually engage Latino voters in this moment in time. I've done a lot of kind of thinking and additional research into how we think about online, media habits of Latino women, of how we think about targeting and reaching and engaging folks online. Our team is doing a lot of work on that right now, and would love to kind of open it up to a conversation about what that means in this moment in time.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. I'll just invite folks, because we can make it, we are a group that's small enough to be able to have a conversation. So those that are on the Zoom link, I invite you to raise your hand and we'll unmute your microphone. But what I would like to do is kick us off a little bit, Stephanie. Can you tell us a little bit more of how did EquisLabs come to be? Why did you help found the organization, and why is the timeliness of talking about Latinx voters?
Yep. So in 2020, Latino voters will be the largest minority group of voters. And so there will be 32 million eligible Latino voters in 2020. And what we came to believe and came to know was that Latino voters have largely been seen in this very binary fashion by folks who are trying to reach them. They're either seen as Cuban American, and everybody else is kind of thrown into a broad pan-Hispanic pot and communicated with the same message. Candidates have long talked to us just about the issue of immigration. And when in reality, as you can see from what I presented, just the depth around gender is there is so much nuance in the community and what the community, cares about, the issues and difference by regionality. And as you can see, the kind of differences about even just who the electorate is in some of these states, from North Carolina and Wisconsin and Michigan to the traditional states of the Southwest, and obviously Florida and Texas. And so we knew that 2020 would be the year that Latinos would be poised to play such a critically important role in this election, given how much the community has been under attack, and that this was not an opportunity that we could squander, where we could not take advantage of creating that better understanding of who the electorate is, and understanding how do we leverage digital data and technology to actually reach and engage them. Because we are a younger electorate, the median age of our community is 28 years old. We spend more time online, we spend more time on mobile, we spend more time just consuming information online. And so what does that mean to how we can reach and communicate with this particular community was something that we felt like couldn't be put off anymore.
Great, thank you so much. We have some questions in the Zoom group chat. What we can do is unmute the participants and then they can voice their question. I'm gonna, can we unmute Tova Wang? Let's see.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much for this. This is really interesting and important. I've been looking with some students on young Latinx in particular in the South, and I'm wondering if there's anything specific that you can tell us about young Latinx women in particular, and what may motivate or not motivate them at this time?
Yeah, I think on the issues themselves, I think the issue of immigration for the first time, uh, it's funny because historically, as we've looked at the way that candidates and campaigns have engaged this community, you would think that the issue of immigration was always the first priority for this community for a very long time. And it's always been an important issue for the community, but it's not always been the top priority. Issues like healthcare, education have generally been the top issue and motivating priorities for the community because they want to provide good, healthy access to healthcare and, good education for their kids. What I will say for the first time in our polling last summer, as we were developing, as we kind of headed through the year, immigration continually was a top issue for how they viewed the political process right now. And I think that that is a really, just again, Trump's handling of the issue of, the border crisis last summer, kids in cages, the border wall, like that is a hugely motivating factor for all age groups of Latinas, but especially young people. I will also say there's a fair amount of research that we are digging into right now related to the primary process and the large levels of support that we saw for Bernie Sanders in this community. A lot of that support was being generated from actually young Latinas. It wasn't young Bernie, Hispanic Bernie bros, as many may have thought or conceived. It was actually being driven by a lot of young Latinas. So I think one of the questions that we are going to be asking in this next phase of polling related to those who were supporting Bernie, especially among those who were women, is was there support for Bernie about him as a candidate and kind of being the Tio Bernie caricature that in, the take no prisoners caricature that he was? Was it the movement that he built and he created? Or was it the set of issues that he tapped into that really tapped into a set of pain and challenge that people are experiencing in their everyday lives? Did he, create a set of policies or tap into a set of policies that people really resonate? Free college, access to healthcare, the way he talked about immigration. And so the way we are trying to kind of extrapolate that is to understand, as for those women who understood and really supported Bernie, what does that mean for what their levels of excitement and participation and motivation are going to be in the general election if he is not the candidate?
Thank you. I'm going to call on Carla. She raised her hand. Can we unmute Carla, please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Can you speak into your microphone a little bit more?
Yeah, give me just a second. Is this better?
Very, much better.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is so rewarding and fascinating to hear about. So, I've had conversations with senior Democratic operatives, most of whom are white men, about the need to mobilize and excite Latinx voters, specifically Latinas. And the answer I get every time is, this demographic doesn't turn out. To your point, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the negative way. And I'm a firm believer that scared money doesn't make money. So, how do you engage those folks, and what do you touch on to try to mobilize them to spend the adequate resources on this demographic?
Great question. And I spend a lot of time in rooms with lots of white men challenging this very assumption. And I think that, like, at the end of the day, and my core argument to a lot of those rooms that I sit in, whether it's operatives or funders, is that I think that Democrats and progressives fundamentally understand that Latinos are not a monolith, but they've never really had the tools or the research to put that into practice. And until we really started this research project a year or so ago, the goal of our research was to really unpack the electorate. And again, not to just unpack it to shape media narratives and to shape the national conversation. That's very important. but at the end of the day is to actually implement the work that we're doing into real field digital and communications programs where we can ultimately shape and change the way that people who are doing on the ground engagement speaking to Latinos are actually communicating with them differently and thinking about program differently and thinking about the places where they are going to reach and engage them online differently. And so I think that we have successfully been able to shift a lot of those conversations and give people a set of tools to do that work more easily, or with a clearer roadmap, let me say. And now we are kind of in the phase as well where we are trying to better understand what are beyond kind of the research and what we know about the community and who the electorate is today and as we head into 2020 and beyond. Because as I also state, Latinos are the new swing voter. You know, we are the new, you know, we are growing rapidly. You know, the pace of our growth of the population is driving US population growth. And so for us, and for us as a country, for us as, you know, for those who identify as progressives or Democrats, like, or even Republicans, if you want to be able to communicate to this audience, like it is a very complex group of people that is not impossible to figure out, but folks just need to spend the time to do it. And I think in the first, you know, 9 months of what we've been able to do, we've been able to unpack some really important opportunities that exist, obviously some critical challenges of where we think resources and investment should go. But I hope that both in that research of identifying better frameworks of who we should be communicating with and who is where, that in addition to that, we are also uncovering better tactics to reach Latino voters, whether that is how we use WhatsApp. You know, 52% of US Latinos use WhatsApp regularly. And so how do we organize within the constraints of WhatsApp? We don't need a new tech tool. There's one that, you know, half of our community is already on and using regularly. And so it's how do we tap into that? There is how we think about creating smarter, more efficient, more resonant digital content, and how do we reach, you know, voters and customers ultimately where they are online and where they're consuming information online, whether that's what news sites or entertainment sites they're going to, or where they're doing e-banking or other kind of parenting research or makeup videos. Like that is where we have to start to think creatively about how we actually treat voters in some ways as customers that we are trying to get to engage, to take an action, a civic engagement, and doing so in a way that we obviously know is a very crowded, noisy environment right now, especially, but even prior to coronavirus was a very crowded, noisy environment.
Thank you, Stephanie and Carla, for your question. I'm going to take a question from YouTube. Adan writes, short of statewide reforms, what steps can campaigns take to keep Latinas motivated to vote when states may have confusing ballot initiatives to vote on?
Right. So I think that one of the most important things, you know, in this moment in time is to really be building and understanding who trusted messengers are so that over time, you know, a lot of this is not going to be sorted out for several months, right? But fortunately, for the most part, most primaries are behind us now. And until we get to the general election, we have some time for all the kind of craziness and confusion of this moment to pan out a little bit. So what we need to do is ensure that we have places where we can reach and engage Latina voters to communicate the right and correct information at the right moment in time, and communicate, as I said earlier, confidence that they have the ability to take that action to vote and that they have enough information for them to go and vote. There's no sense in starting to really engage voters in the process now in terms of what's happening in the, you know, is the state going to do that or is that state going to do this? When we're thinking about bringing new people into the process, we want to communicate to them at a place where it's going to make sense, where they're going to continue to feel, where we're going to be able to build trust and confidence in the process and be able to build their own trust and confidence in being able to vote. And so I think while there just seems to be a lot of kind of confusion, mass confusion right now about how elections are going to take place in, you know, 6-7 months from now, the best thing that we can be doing is communicating to those Latino voters right now on other topics and creating and building relationships with them, either person to person, relational contact, or through other means to build those relations and following so that when we do have the right information, that we are feeding that to them and making sure that we give them that confidence to go and vote.
Thank you for that. I'm going to call on Adria Marquez. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so
Hi.
much for all of this very insightful information. One of the things that really fascinated me was the concept of the difference between motivation and support. And especially given the time of coronavirus, thinking about motivation is especially ironic. So considering where we are today, you know, it's hard to think about what the right messaging is to motivate people to do anything. And it almost feels like politics and elections have taken a second or third place in people's minds, right, and concerns. So on the other hand, we are seeing some very optimistic and hopeful changes, right? The way that people are using technology to stay connected, what family and community means to every different person. So I think there are some great, hopeful moments that we can maximize on. Have you seen or do you know of organizations, brands, or people who are leveraging that technology in a positive way, in a successful way, that are reaching people with the right type of messaging?
Yep. So a couple things. One, I will start with kind of the 3 or 4 things we are going to, you know, really are good baseline measures for us to kind of keep tracking over time. One is support levels. You know, are they consistently kind of staying at the levels of support now that Joe Biden is the candidate versus Donald Trump? So that's like one measure of support. When it's a generic, in the previous polls and everything that I presented today was basically presenting whether or not Latinas supported a generic, unnamed generic Democratic candidate against Trump. So it doesn't give a lot of contours around the bio or other things that could shift and change people's opinions. So one is like, will they continue their high levels of anti-Trumpism over time now that Joe Biden is the nominee? 2 is, will they maintain their levels of motivation and excitement? And will their motivation stay high and their excitement stay at where it is right now? Or will excitement continue to rise? Or will motivation and excitement drop because of kind of everything that's happening? So I think that'll be one of the interesting things that we will continue to try to track in our next wave of polling. But in terms of you know, seeing the kind of work that I think is really importantly being done to reach and engage these communities, I would kind of point to 2 distinct approaches. One is there are a number of different approaches, especially now that folks are using to continue to engage in the person-to-person contact of you know, relational voting, which is, you know, we know that one of the most effective, and everybody who goes to Harvard, if you haven't taken Marshall Ganz's class, you know, relational is just old school organizing, person to person, warm relationship contact, right? It's, I know 10 people and they are familiar with me, and therefore me reaching out to them, encouraging them to vote or vote for something, vote for someone, just vote, period, will have a better effect than me having a cold contact to any of those people. So I think anything that is, especially now in this time, leveraging, or will continue in this time, leveraging people's personal networks and relationships to increase levels of support and participation is always a very effective measure. That being said, I know there are a lot of new and interesting approaches for how we think about engagement online. And 2 things that I will point to are 2 platforms called PushBlack and Pulso, which both use Facebook Messenger. PushBlack, they're sister companies, but PushBlack basically sends out 1 Black History fact a day, and have built, and 90% of the time they're communicating with their users. They are not communicating about politics. They are communicating about Black culture and history. And the same with Pulso, which is the Hispanic version of that. And essentially what they're trying to do with that is create a relationship with a set of subscribers and users, that they then at critical moments in time can direct them to register to vote and can remind them to register to vote. And what you can see and what we saw in the 2018 elections with pushback was they had amassed, a couple million different subscribers that were receiving their Black history and culture facts every day. And when they pivoted them to voter registration and when they pivoted them to the active GOTV, get out the vote, they saw their content go viral because people were sharing it from Facebook message. And so it was a combination of using technology and the previous thing I mentioned, which was relational organizing and using warm contacts. So people who were sharing information with their Facebook friends, your Facebook friends are people who know you. And so when they were receiving something that said, go vote or register to vote, it meant a lot more than a just random paid digital ad that somebody received on their Facebook feed.
Great, thank you for that. We had a question around Latinas' use of social media, but I think we hit on that. We had a follow-up question about how Latinas feel about voting by mail. Is there a higher or a lower confidence level, or is there data even on that?
So I would say a couple things. One, on the first question related to Latinas and social media, I would encourage folks to go to our website, and I'll just call out a couple of websites and Twitter handles here. EquisLabs, labs.us, and equisresearch.us are both very important websites where you can receive our information and research that we put out regularly. In addition to that, you should follow us on Twitter at EquisResearch. We recently released a media consumption survey last week that really looks at the media consumption habits of Latinos and Latinas online and on television. And so it's an important thing for folks to kind of take a look at and see where esports, e-gaming, but also that Latinos are going online more for entertainment, not necessarily news, or consuming, television more for entertainment than news, are a couple of our key findings. So I'd really encourage people to check those out. With relation to kind of the impact of the current environment and on vote by mail and kind of sentiment of where people are. We did an analysis of public polling a couple of weeks ago related to COVID, both on the immediate effects of the COVID crisis on the community, but also residual effects on public wanting to go to public places and or willingness to participate in polling places and going to polling places. And what we found was, I think just like the general population, there's a huge reluctance to go in public, and there's a huge reticence to even go to a place like a polling location. And so I think that, that is something that we are really going to have to contend with. I think Matt Barretto at the UCLA Public Policy School has started to do some research on Latinos and vote by mail to try to understand what are attitudes around people's desire and willingness to participate in vote by mail efforts. So I think there's a lot more digging into that we have to do in there. And as in addition to vote by mail, there's a huge number of unregistered but eligible Latinos. So we've also had to kind of increase and accelerate the focus on online voter registration efforts instead of site-based voter registration. And so that is like another area that we at Equis are starting to delve into with relation to testing different approaches around online voter registration in a place like Florida with Puerto Rican voters. What is it that we need to know about how people might be willing to engage in a voter registration process online? And every state, as you all know, is incredibly different. Every state has a different process, and it is an imperfect system in all of these states. And so it is something that the entire kind of movement is having to kind of contend with right now about how do we shift into this new space around online voter registration when everything feels very different, or every state is incredibly different, and it's all going to be challenging.
Great, thank you. So a question to finish us off. Let's see, is Monty Allen still with us? Then I'll read out his question in reaching out to Latinas, who will be the most effective spokesperson? He says maybe not me, an older white man, but who is talking to these Latinas who then in turn become trusted messengers for their community?
Right. So we started a digital content test, which started to look at different approaches related to messenger and tone among 4 key subgroups. We looked at younger Latinas, older Latinas, young men, and rural Hispanics, and essentially tested with all 4 of those subgroups. We tested 5 different messengers. We tested an abuelita, an abuelito, a young Hispanic woman, a young Hispanic male, and we had a control with a white woman. And they all delivered the same set of messages, but with different tones. And so there was an angry tone, an emotional tone, a kind of just like general tone. And ultimately, what we discovered was that there was this interesting kind of symbiotic relationship between older women, older Latinas, and younger Latino men. And so the best messenger for the younger Latino male happened to be the older Latino woman, and vice versa. And for the younger Latina, it was, also it was less conclusive. And so we're still kind of working through that. But I think the idea with these tests is to really try to understand and unpack that, right? Which is if you are developing a television ad, what spokesperson, and especially what digital provides us the unique opportunity to do is to sub-target very specific groups of people. So you can actually create an audience online to just reach Latino women, right? You can just create an audience to reach just young Latino men. And if that is your strategy, you want to make sure you have the right messengers. And so you could create the exact same message around voting or voter registration, but the delivery of who is saying it or how they are saying it might differ. And that is something that we're continuing to dig into.
Great. So we have a lot of great questions from YouTube. I'm going to pop over to one of them, and we'll just, go over our time a little bit. From Shirley, given the importance of religion as a marker, what are the ways we can partner with religious organizations to drive out turnout?
Well, I think this actually brings up a very interesting question because, we do see, even some softness among, especially evangelical women around the treatment and the handling of issues like immigration and Trump's morality. And we see that really pronounced among Hispanic Catholic women. And obviously there are limits from within what we can do within the church. What we've seen is a couple really interesting programs. One, an organization called Faith in Public Life in 2018 ran a program that was a Padrino and a Padrina postcard program. Postcards are a very efficient way to remind people to register to vote or to go make a plan to vote. And the concept that they used was they created a universe of Catholic going people, Hispanics, and created a godparent system. So these godparents wrote them postcards to remind them they were like their padrinos, their godparents for voting. And so that was a really interesting concept, and they were actually able, among the universe of people that they targeted, to increase participation, voter participation, by a statistically significant amount. And so it's unique programs like that that are really kind of leaning on grassroots organizing, because obviously the church won't necessarily kind of allow that organizing within, that leverages, folks who are already kind of socially engaged, already have the right networks, and using unique proven tools to try to engage and reach folks. So I think that there's a whole set of things around messaging that will be able to be done around immigration and morality. But I think as it relates to actually that warm contact and ownership around the process of voting, there's a whole set of things that I think that are interesting that groups are experimenting with, that we will certainly see this election too.
Great. So I'm going to ask the last question. This comes from Eva. Research shows some in the Latinx population avoid voting as to not stigmatize those without citizenship. How can we combat this barrier, and also to avoid outing those without citizenship?
So what's interesting about that, and that's the first time that I've really seen that. I'd be interested in reading more about that study. I think for me, one of the things that I found in the digital tests we did around messaging, we used one messenger and we tested 8 different messages, like a social pressure message that, if your neighbors know your voting record is public, and it's more of like a shaming message, right? We did an immigration message, we did a morality message. But the message that had one of the highest levels of response was what we called a vote for me message. And what that message was essentially a DACA recipient or a dreamer who said, I can't vote, or an immigrant, and said, I can't vote. I need you to vote on my behalf. And that happened to be one of the best performing videos with the greatest number of subgroups that we tested. And we actually tested that in coordination with United We Dream, because one of the powers that United We Dream and the Dreamers have, with 700,000 plus dreamers, is those dreamers have friends and families who are US citizens. And so there's nothing more powerful than a dreamer or DACA recipient being able to ask their friends and family to vote on their behalf, and their social networks to vote on their behalf. And it creates a sense of ownership. And again, that relational contact, that you don't actually have to be a voter to, one, knock doors or make phone calls, and two, you don't have to be a voter to ask other people to vote. And if your friends and family feel so compelled to want to vote on your behalf, that can be a very compelling and powerful reason to move them.
Great. Well, with that, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you again, Stephanie, for joining us.
Thank you, Teresa.
This talk will be posted on the Ash Center website. If you liked what we were talking about today, I invite you to join our part 2 conversation around Latinx voters and grassroots organizing on April 20th. You can find the details on the Ash Center website. And then please tune in to next week as well for a workshop hosted by another Tech and Democracy fellow, Eric Wilson, on the 21st. You can follow our work at Harvard Ash. And lastly, thank you to the audience for joining us. Take care, everyone.